Did he just have no clue how absolutely racist this country was? Actually, kind of still is.
Yeah, I mean, he was misreading the situation, I'll just say that. So, by 1936, Hitler has discarded the Treaty of Versailles, and he's building up German military might. He's rearming Germany. And this pulled Germany out of the Depression because he basically started borrowing money like crazy to do armaments production and hiring people, and this kickstarted the economy, and Germany's economy pulled out of the Depression by 1934-35 and was just taking off because the German government was spending so much money on defense procurement. Then he turns his mind to creating Greater Germany. And so this is a three-step process. In 1938. In 1938, Hitler goes to the Chancellor of Austria, and I'm not going to go into all the details because I don't want to spend time on it, but he basically manufactures a diplomatic crisis with Austria and then invades Austria. And then he very immediately holds a plebiscite to see if Austrians want to join Germany, and 99% of them say they want to join Germany, which, as a historian, you could say, wow, that's a really popular idea, or you could say, wow, they rigged the vote. And I'm guessing it was the latter because I've never heard of any nation being 99.9% on board with anything. In 1938, Hitler also forms the Axis alliance with Italy. Italy is a fascist government under Mussolini, and so they make an alliance. And then, after Japan, when Japan is invading China by now, Hitler makes an alliance with Japan. They all become the Axis. And you'll be happy to know that the treaty that created the alliance between Germany and Japan stated that Germany views the Japanese as honorary Aryans.
That answers that question. I was just gonna say, like, kind of, what did they use to justify allying with
Japan?
a country that is not white when they're so horrendously racist?
Yeah, they basically argued that just as the Aryans were the master race of Europe, Japan was the master race of Asia, and game recognizes game. So in March of 1938, he takes Austria, and Hitler was from Austria, so he was basically retaking his home country so he could go back home and say, see, I made something myself.
When I was younger, I'd never seen the ending of The Sound of Music. And my elementary school took us to a high school to go watch it done. In school, high school, they just like really good plays, musicals. And I didn't, they got to the end. And I remember my school was leave early because our bus was there, but right as we were to leave, obviously, like the car happened or the Nazis take over. So one day all these like high school kids start marching down like the stairs. I was like, ah! I didn't know what was happening.
Yeah. Is this the takeover?
I didn't know what was happening. So I was like, what's happening? I just didn't see the end of the Sound of Music.
Oh, good.
Thanks.
In September of 1938, Hitler tells Czechoslovakia that they have to give him the Sudetenland. That's the area of Czechoslovakia right over here at the end of Czechoslovakia that is predominantly German. And he basically says to Czechoslovakia, you have to hand over the Sudetenland or I am going to go to war. And Czechoslovakia was not in a good place to resist German aggression at that point. But the Czechs said, hey, we've got an alliance with Britain and France. If you go to war with us, you're starting World War II, and you're gonna get it from England and France, and look how that happened last time. You don't want to do that. And Hitler basically says, I don't care And much to everybody's, he said, I'm going to do it anyway unless you hand over the Sudetenland. And the Czechs say no, and much to everybody's surprise, France and Great Britain then say to Hitler, can we talk? And they meet in Munich, and they bring Mussolini, Hitler's ally, just because he has nothing to do with it, but they don't invite the Czechs. And they basically, the four of them get together and they say, and the British and French basically say, we don't want war. We don't want to go to war with you. Is this really all you want? You want the Sudetenland? Is that what you want? And Hitler says, yes, that's all I want. You know, hand on my heart, that's all I'm interested in. And so the British and French basically say, okay, sign here. We will tell the Czechs we are not going to stop you from taking the Sudetenland, and they're on their own. And you can take the Sudetenland, but you have to promise this is the last thing you want. And so much to Hitler is shocked by this. Is like, you're just capitulating? And so he signs, and the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain goes back to England and he gets off the airplane waving a piece of paper saying, we have peace in our time, we're not going to war. And the French Prime Minister, Daladier, he thought he was going to get lynched when he got off the airplane, but it turns out the crowds there were happy to see him because they thought also he had averted a war. And so Hitler occupies the Sudetenland, and then he manufactures an international crisis and takes the rest of Czechoslovakia. So he occupies the Sudetenland in September of 1938, and then in March of 1939, he occupies the rest of Czechoslovakia. Any questions? So Hitler's next goal is to take Poland. And in particular, when Poland was created, at the Versailles talks, they'd been drawing up Germany's borders here, with markers on the floor. And they had decided that Poland should have a port on an ocean. And so this is East Prussia. It was a predominantly German-speaking, and so they didn't want to take that away from Germany. But they took the city of Gdansk, which is Danzig, and Danzig was actually like 75% German-speaking. But they gave Danzig or Gdansk to Poland because it was a port on the Baltic Sea, and then they gave it what's called the Gdansk or Danzig corridor, which is about a 100-mile across corridor heading to the Baltic Sea. So Germany was divided in two parts, right? East Prussia's over here and Germany's over here, but they're all part of Germany, and this little chunk of Poland goes right through the middle. Well, Hitler demands in August of 1939, he says to the Poles, hand over the Danzig corridor so I can reconnect my two parts of Germany. And the Poles say no, and Hitler says, I'll invade. And the Poles say, well, we have a treaty with Britain and France that they will back us up. And Hitler says, have you talked to the Czechs lately? But the Poles had one thing that the Czechs didn't, which is that before World War I, half of Poland had been part of Russia. And the Russians, the Soviets, although this is a new government since World War I, etc., the Soviets still saw Eastern Poland as rightfully theirs. Now, they had actually fought a war with Poland in 1921 where they had tried to take Poland back. Poland declared its independence and they invaded, but the Poles pushed them back out. So the Russians have sort of grumbled about it, but they have not really recognized Poland. They're like, no, the East Poland is ours. Okay, so the Poles know, and the Germans know, that if they try to take Poland, the Russians are going to be pissed about it. So the Poles also know that, Czechoslovakia had been entirely part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that doesn't exist. So there's nobody who thinks Czechoslovakia is theirs. But the Soviets think Poland is theirs. And so the Poles are kind of confident that even if Britain and France don't back them up, and Britain and France, folded up like a wet noodle in the Czech crisis, even if Britain and France don't back them up, they're pretty sure that the Russians, simply because they hate the Poles and want to conquer Poland, will not allow the Germans to conquer Poland. But what the Poles don't know is that in the last week of August, the Germans and the Soviets, the Nazis and the Soviets, had carried out a secret negotiation, and they suddenly announced the Nazi-Soviet Pact. It's sometimes called the Hitler-Ribbentrop Pact, or the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, or the Hitler-Stalin Pact. It's got a bunch of names. But basically, this is an agreement. Publicly, all it says is that Germany and the Soviet Union agree not to go to war for 5 years. Which, you'd think, duh. But this was actually shocking to the whole world, because Hitler's entire career was built on being anti-communist. I will crush communism, I will crush the Soviet Union. And he'd been talking for years about a drawing knock Austrian and conquering the Soviet Union. It's like, what? You're saying you're not going to invade for 5 years? What the hell? But what nobody knew is there were secret clauses to the Nazi-Soviet Pact. And the secret clauses were, if either the Soviet Union or Germany happens to invade Poland, they agree to split it between them on the border, the pre-World War I border. And if the Soviet Union feels like it and invades Finland or Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, which all used to be part of Russia, Germany would not squawk about that. They're fine with that. So Stalin, the dictator of Russia, thinks the Nazi-Soviet Pact buys him 5 years. And this is really important for him, because Stalin had carried out, in 1936 to 38, Stalin had carried out a massive purge of his army. He had arrested 36,000 army officers and thrown them in prison camps, and had shot several thousand of them. And of the 8 field marshals, which is the top rank in the Russian army, he had shot 7 of them. So and when you purge 36,000 army officers, you have to just promote younger people into those positions. So his whole army was incredibly young and inexperienced. And he knew that he was totally not ready for a war. So Stalin was like, cool, I got 5 years to rebuild my army before I might have to fight the Germans. This is awesome. And I get to take Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, and half Poland. Cool. For the Germans, they just want to make sure that if they try to take Poland, the Soviets are fine with it. And the Germans only care about the western half of Poland because that's where the German speakers are. And Hitler had absolutely no intention of abiding by the Nazi-Soviet Pact as far as not going to war with the Soviet Union for 5 years. He totally signed it knowing he was going to break it. In fact, the Czech crisis, Hitler actually thought he was starting a war with the Czech crisis. That we now know that after he signed the Munich Agreement with Britain and France, saying he could take the Sudetenland and Britain and France wouldn't stop him, he had a 3-hour ranting, screaming tirade because the goddamn British and French had cheated him out of his war. So he really wanted to go to war. But you had a question.
So, it seems like it's a bit of a trend of Hitler agreeing to stuff and then just promptly breaking that. So
Yeah.
why did anybody keep making deals with him?
Well, usually by the time Hitler was wily enough that by the time you realized he'd screwed you, he had already screwed you. So by the time Stalin realized that Hitler had just played him like a fiddle, the Wehrmacht was halfway to Moscow. And by the time the Poles realized that Germany had played them like a fiddle, they were already invaded. And by the time the Czechs realized it, they were already screwed.
Also, is this when the Soviets try to take Finland and then get demolished?
Yes, in 39, I'll get to that in a second. I'll include that. So Hitler signs the Nazi-Soviet Pact in August, or rather Ribbentrop signs the Nazi-Soviet Pact in August of 1939. And on September 1st, he signs it like August 24th. On September 1st, less than a week later, the Germans invade Poland. Now, the Germans don't want to look like they're just invading Poland, and so what they do is they have a concentration camp or two sitting around, and they got prisoners in there. So they take a bunch of prisoners out of one of the concentration camps, and they dress them up in Polish army uniforms, and they take them to a German border town, and they shoot them all and scatter them around the street, and then they invite a bunch of European and American reporters in and say, look, the Poles invaded Germany, and we shot them all. Look, here's all the dead Poles. And then they declared war, and they just happened to have the entire German military mobilized to invade Poland. When that happened, and so they invade Poland. And I'm going to talk later about the nature of World War II and how it's different than World War I in terms of the nature of the fighting. But let me just get the war started here, which is Britain and France finally realized that Hitler doesn't mean anything he says. And so they finally realized that if they let him get away with taking Poland, he's just going to take something else. He's just going to take something else. And so reluctantly on September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France both declare war on Germany. They honor the treaty with Poland. They didn't honor the treaty with Czechoslovakia, but they realized that not doing that was a bad idea, and they honor the treaty with Poland. They declare war on Germany. But nothing happens because, for several reasons. One, Germany is focused on conquering Poland. And I will point out, as soon as Germany conquers Poland, the Russians sign a treaty saying if Germany invades Poland, Russia gets half of it. And then a week later, Germany invades Poland, and the Russians are like, what, we're starting? And then the Russians have to race their troops in to invade Poland, the eastern half of Poland, to take control of that. And they were actually literally taking taxis to invade Poland. But the Poles were so focused on fighting off the Germans, they were totally taken aback that the Russians invaded them out of nowhere. But there's a great story that I had a friend in graduate school. He became a history professor also at Marshall University. But he had a girlfriend who was Polish, and he spent a lot of summers over in Poland with his girlfriend. And he met her father and her grandfather. And her grandfather had a memory of being a child in World War II, and 1939, the war starts, and they hear all about the news that the Germans are invading, the Nazis are invading, and then their town starts getting shelled, and so they go to the basement, and they're hiding in the basement, and they're in the basement for like 3 days while and they hear gunfire in the streets, and then the war is here, and they're like, oh my gosh, we're in the eastern part of Poland, how did the Germans get here so fast? But then finally the fighting stops, and the father sticks his head out the window and he goes, Jesus Maria, Bolshevikis! Meaning he looks out the window and he sees the Bolsheviks, not Nazis, that have invaded the country, and he had no idea that the Russians were doing it. Jesus Maria is Jesus and Mary, it's the Bolsheviks. So the Poles basically invaded from both sides. Most of the Polish army is in the west trying to fight off the Germans because that's the only army they thought they were fighting. It takes the Germans about 6 weeks to just crush Western Poland. And the Russians just invade almost unopposed from the east because the Poles are not ready for that. The Russians would then immediately invade Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland. Not immediately, it takes them a little while to prepare because they really weren't ready for this. But in early 1940, Russia invades Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland. The first three, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, they don't even try to fight because they're totally not prepared for this and they're tiny compared to the Soviet Union, and they just get conquered. And the Russians would then carry out a massive ethnic cleansing. They would arrest everybody who was a leader in any of those countries and ship them to Siberia or shoot them. And they would bring in thousands of Russians to settle in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia to sort of make them Russian. Finland would fight. And Finland actually, in the so-called Winter War, which is early 1940, Finland basically fights the Russians to a standstill because the Finns are really ready for this, and they have they've designed equipment for fighting, and they have cross-country ski snipers, and they have white uniforms, etc., and the Russians don't. And the Russians just get their asses handed to them. And so the Finns actually fight the Russians to a standstill and then sign a treaty in early 1940 where the Russians get a little sliver of territory, but then they agree to pull out of Finland. Finland would then become an ally of Germany's during World War II, but they would not significantly support the Germans. They just wanted an ally against the Russians. But it goes down as Finland's great shame to have been on the German side of World War II, but they never fought anybody but the Russians. in any significant way. That's also where you get the Russian foreign minister was a guy named Molotov, and he when Russia invaded Finland, all these other newspapers all over the world were like, what are you doing? Why are you invading Finland? And the Soviet line was, we're not invading Finland, we're bringing them humanitarian supplies. We're using the Russian military to bring humanitarian supplies into Finland. We're bringing them food. And the Finns, of course, realized they're being invaded. And so they decided that, and they were improvising a lot of stuff. And what they discovered was that in the Spanish Civil War, 36 to 39, the Spaniards had developed a improvised bomb where you'd take a glass bottle and fill it up with gasoline and stick a rag in it and light the rag and throw it. And when it hit something, the glass would break and you would get an explosion. And the Finns start using this against Russian tanks and Russian soldiers. And as a shot at Molotov, they say, oh, Molotov's bringing us food. Well, here's a Molotov cocktail for you. And we'll give him cocktails. So the Finns invented the Molotov cocktail, the name. The Spanish had invented the actual thing, but the Finns had invented the name. But Britain and France don't do anything. Britain doesn't have a big standing army. Britain has a long-standing policy of not having a standing army. They're an island, they have a fantastic navy, they basically are in no danger of being invaded, so they don't have a standing army. So the British start immediately, they have a small standing army, a very small one, and they immediately send that to France. They think they're going to have the usual fight with the Germans in northern France, in trenches, etc. That's not what they get, but they initially send about 350,000 troops to northern France to fight with the French against the British. But the French, and then the British start doing a draft and raising an army in preparation for a real fight later. The French actually have no interest in invading Germany because they have spent the 1930s developing the so-called Maginot Line. Named after the French general who developed it. The Maginot Line this is the border, this is the Rhine River here, and then there's this border here, and the Rhine River goes into Germany, but this is the German-French border. And so the French had decided that if the Germans ever invaded France again, they were going to make sure that the Germans that the war was not fought in France. So they created the Maginot Line in the 1930s, which was a series of tunnels and bunkers and gun emplacements. This is all mountainous region here in Alsace and Lorraine. It's mountains. And so they had built a whole series of fortresses right in the mountains that went hundreds of meters underground, and they were connected by dozens and dozens of miles and miles of tunnels, and they had bunkers and radar stations and carefully placed gun emplacements that had overlapping fire zones, etc. And they were absolutely certain that there was no way anybody is getting through the Maginot Line. And given that, when they declare war on Germany, they basically just sit down at the Maginot Line and say they can attack us, and they're going to beat their heads against the Maginot Line and get nowhere, and we will slaughter them, but we just have to sit here until they attack. And so they did. They sat there from September of 1939 until the Germans finally attacked in May of 1940. And so that first 9 months, basically Germany invades Poland in 6 weeks, and then nothing happens for the rest of 1939 and early 1940. The French called it the drôle de guerre, the joke of a war. The British called it either the phony war or the sitting war. Because basically, the British were over in northern France just sitting there, and the French were on the Maginot Line just sitting there, and the Germans weren't anywhere near them because they were over there solidifying control of Poland, and Russia was invading Finland, but that was it. There was nothing going on. Any questions? All right, so next time, yes?
So if they tried to invade Germany, like first the war would be completely different?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Now, the French did not have they really didn't have a battle plan for invading Germany because they were going to use Maginot Line and just let the Germans beat their heads against it. So they really weren't ready to invade. They had their army was big, it was mobilized. The French still had the universal conscription, and they were mobilizing the military, etc. But they just didn't have a plan for invading Germany. But they probably would not have run into much German resistance because the bulk of the German army was in Poland.
So they had 9 months.
Yes.
And then didn't.
They didn't. They were just so traumatized by World War I. They were like, we're just going to sit behind the national line because this is how we want to fight the war. So.
And they did not think that Germany would do the same thing. So why not extend it north through the Belgian border?
Belgium was an ally, and it wouldn't look good to put a Maginot line between you and your ally. And they also thought the Ardennes forest was impenetrable to an army because it was such a dense forest, and it wasn't. Any questions?
I think it was impenetrable when they very clearly were no longer fighting like a medieval war. It's a weird line of thought.
All right, have a great weekend. We'll see you all on Monday, and we will finish Saving Private Ryan on Monday.